chaos of medieval Japan's greatest civil war, one warrior stood undefeated on the battlefield. Not a legendary shogun, not a celebrated general, but a woman whose skill with the blade made grown samurai tremble. Her name was Tomoe Gozen. She beheaded enemy commanders, led cavalry charges into impossible odds, and vanished from history at the peak of her power. What really happened to Japan's most lethal female warrior? And why did the samurai class try so hard to erase her story? The year is 1184. The final battle of the Genpei War rages across the plains of Awazu. Two rival clans, the Minamoto and the Taira, fight for control of all Japan. The morning sun barely pierces through the smoke of burning villages. Arrows darken the sky like deadly rain. And in the center of this maelstrom, a lone warrior cuts through enemy lines with terrifying precision. This warrior wears the ornate armor of a high-ranking samurai. In one hand, a razor-sharp naginata, a curved blade mounted on a wooden pole. In the other, a bow that few men could even string. The enemy forces close in, dozens of mounted warriors converging from all sides. It should be a death sentence. But this samurai doesn't retreat, doesn't hesitate. Instead, this warrior charges directly into the enemy formation, and what follows defies everything the opposing forces thought possible about combat, about honor, and about who could become a legend on the battlefield. That warrior was Tomoe Gozen, and her story forces us to completely reimagine what we thought we knew about samurai, about women in feudal Japan, and about one of the bloodiest conflicts in Asian history. To understand Tomoe Gozen, we must first understand the Japan she was born into, a world most people today would barely recognize. The late Heian period, stretching from 794 to 1185, was a time of elegant culture and brutal violence existing side by side. While aristocrats in the imperial capital of Kyoto composed poetry and practiced elaborate tea ceremonies, the provinces burned with conflict. Power was slipping away from the emperor's court and into the hands of military families, the samurai clans. Two clans dominated this turbulent era, the Taira and the Minamoto. Think of them as the Montagues and Capulets of medieval Japan, except their family feud would drench the entire country in blood for decades. The Taira clan, also known as the Heike, had seized control of the imperial court through marriage alliances and political maneuvering. They wore red banners and markers into battle. The Minamoto clan, called the Genji, wore white, and they nursed a burning resentment at being pushed from power. This wasn't just a political dispute. This was about honor, revenge, and the very soul of Japan. Tomoe Gozen was born sometime around 1157, though the exact date remains lost to history. Even her birthplace sparks debate among historians. Most evidence suggests she came from Shinano province, in the mountainous region of what's now Nagano Prefecture. This was harsh, unforgiving country. High peaks, deep forests, brutal winters. The kind of place that either killed you or made you extraordinarily strong. Her family name Gozen isn't actually a surname in the way we understand it today. It's an honorific title, roughly translating to lady or mistress, typically reserved for women of high status. This tells us something crucial. Tomoe wasn't just any warrior. She came from a family with connections, with status, with the resources to train her properly. But here's where the historical record becomes frustratingly sparse. Unlike male samurai, whose lineages were meticulously documented, women's histories were often considered unworthy of detailed record-keeping. We know Tomoe existed because she appears in the Heike Monogatari, the epic tale of the Genpei War compiled in the early 13th century. But the details of her childhood, her family, her early training, those pieces have been swallowed by time. What we can piece together comes from understanding the broader context of women's roles in this period. Contrary to what many believe, women in Heian and early Kamakura period Japan had far more rights and opportunities than they would in later centuries. Women could inherit property, they could own land, they could divorce, and yes, they could be trained in martial arts. The concept of the Onna-Musha, female warriors, wasn't fiction. It was historical reality. Samurai families understood something practical. When enemy forces attacked your home, everyone needed to know how to fight. Samurai women were routinely trained in the use of the naginata, the curved blade polearm that became their signature weapon. This wasn't about gender equality in the modern sense. It was about survival. The naginata was perfectly suited for female warriors. Its length compensated for any difference in reach or physical strength. Its curved blade could slice through armor with proper technique, and its versatility made it deadly in skilled hands. You could slash, thrust, hook, or trip opponents. A master of the naginata could hold off multiple attackers, making it the ideal weapon for defending homes when the men were away at war. But Tomoe wasn't just trained in self-defense. She was trained as a true warrior. The Heike Monogatari describes her martial prowess in terms that would make most male samurai jealous. She was, according to the text, a remarkably strong archer, and as a swordswoman, she was worth 1,000 warriors, ready to confront either demon or god, mounted or on foot. Think about what this means. The chroniclers, who had every cultural reason to downplay a woman's military abilities, couldn't help but acknowledge her exceptional skill. When they say she was worth 1,000 warriors, this isn't poetic exaggeration. This is the medieval equivalent of saying she was a one-woman army. But who trained her? And why was she trained to such an extraordinary degree? The most likely answer involves a man named Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a name that would become inseparably linked with Tomoe's fate. Yoshinaka was a complex figure, and understanding him is crucial to understanding Tomoe's story. He was born in 1154, making him roughly 3 years older than Tomoe, though again, exact dates are uncertain. What we know for certain is that Yoshinaka's childhood was marked by tragedy and exile. His father, Minamoto no Yoshikata, was killed when Yoshinaka was just an infant, murdered in a political purge by members of his own Minamoto clan. Yes, you heard that right. The Minamoto didn't just fight the Taira, they fought each other, constantly, viciously. It was a clan famous for internal betrayals that would make Shakespeare weep. After his father's death, the infant Yoshinaka was spirited away to Kiso Valley, deep in the mountains of Shinano Province. He was raised by a local lord named Nakahara Kanato, who served as his protector and foster father. This is where Yoshinaka earned his other name, Kiso Yoshinaka, after the region that sheltered him. And this is almost certainly where he met Tomoe. The exact nature of their relationship remains one of history's most intriguing mysteries. The Heike Monogatari identifies Tomoe as Yoshinaka's attendant or retainer. Some accounts describe her as his concubine. Other sources suggest she might have been his foster sister, raised in the same household. What's clear is that their bond was deep, complex, and utterly unbreakable. The most compelling theory suggests that Tomoe was the daughter of Nakahara Kanato, the same man who raised Yoshinaka. If true, this would make her Yoshinaka's foster sister, which in medieval Japan created bonds as strong as blood. It would also explain why she received such exceptional martial training. She was being raised in a household preparing for war, training the future leader of a Minamoto uprising. Imagine their childhood. Two young people, growing up in mountain exile, knowing that one day they would either reclaim their clan's honor or die trying. Every day training, every night planning. The mountains of Kiso Valley became their training ground. Steep terrain that built endurance, dense forests that taught stealth, harsh winters that forged resilience. Yoshinaka trained to be a general. Tomoe trained to be his weapon. But she was more than just his bodyguard. The relationship between Yoshinaka and Tomoe, as depicted in historical sources, suggests a partnership built on absolute trust. In battle, Yoshinaka could assign Tomoe to the most dangerous positions because he knew she would succeed where others would fail. He could split his forces, knowing Tomoe could command a detachment with the skill of a seasoned general. This level of trust wasn't given lightly in samurai culture, where women warriors were accepted in theory, but rarely granted command positions in practice. So what made Tomoe different? Raw talent certainly played a role. The Heike Monogatari's description of her abilities isn't generic praise. It's specific, detailed, and impressive. She was noted particularly for her archery, which in medieval Japanese warfare was considered the pinnacle of martial skill. Samurai culture revered the bow above all other weapons. The Kyuba no Michi, the way of horse and bow, was considered the true path of the warrior. To be called an exceptional archer wasn't a casual compliment. It meant you could hit moving targets while riding at full gallop. It meant you could gauge distance, wind, and trajectory in a split second. It meant you had spent thousands of hours from childhood onward, drawing a bow until your fingers bled and your shoulders screamed, until the weapon became an extension of your body. Tomoe mastered this, but she didn't stop there. She also became devastatingly effective with the tachi, the long, curved sword that was the samurai's soul, and with the naginata, that elegant polearm that could tear through cavalry charges. She was a complete warrior, trained in every aspect of combat. On horseback, she was virtually unstoppable. On foot, she was lethal. But combat skills alone don't make you a legend. What set Tomoe apart was something deeper, something that medieval chroniclers struggled to articulate. She had the samurai spirit, the Bushido ethos of absolute loyalty, fearless courage, and unshakable honor. In a culture that prized these qualities above life itself, Tomoe embodied them as purely as any male warrior. More than that, she combined this warrior spirit with tactical intelligence and strategic thinking that impressed even the most experienced generals. By the time she reached her mid-20s, Tomoe Gozen had become exactly what Yoshinaka needed for the war that was coming, because war was coming, and it would consume all of Japan. The year 1180 marked the official beginning of the Genpei War, though in truth, this conflict had been brewing for decades. The Taira clan, under the leadership of Taira no Kiyomori, had achieved something unprecedented. They had essentially seized control of the imperial government without deposing the emperor. Through strategic marriages, they placed their members in every position of power. Kiyomori's daughter became empress. His grandson became emperor. The Taira didn't just dominate the court, they were the court. This arrogance would be their undoing. In April 1180, Prince Mochihito, a frustrated imperial prince passed over for the throne, issued a call to arms. His message went out to the surviving members of the Minamoto clan scattered across Japan. Rise up and destroy the Taira. Reclaim the honor they stole from us. Save Japan from their corruption. Most of the Minamoto leaders who answered this call would soon be dead. The Taira responded with overwhelming force, crushing early uprisings before they could gain momentum. Prince Mochihito himself was killed in June, barely 2 months after issuing his declaration. But the spark had been lit. Across Japan, Minamoto warriors began to mobilize, and in the mountains of Kiso Valley, Yoshinaka prepared for the moment he had been training for his entire life. Yoshinaka's position was precarious. He was a Minamoto, yes, but he was also an outsider, a mountain warrior raised far from the power centers of Kamakura and Kyoto. The main branch of the Minamoto clan was led by Minamoto no Yoritomo, who was also Yoshinaka's cousin. You might think this would create natural allies. You would be wrong. Yoritomo and Yoshinaka distrusted each other from the start. Yoritomo, establishing his base in Kamakura, saw himself as the rightful leader of the entire Minamoto clan. Yoshinaka, commanding fierce loyalty from the mountain warriors of Shinano, had no interest in subordinating himself to a cousin he barely knew. This internal Minamoto tension would become as important to the war's outcome as the conflict with the Taira. But in 1180, as the Genpei War erupted across Japan, Yoshinaka focused on building his power base, and at his side always was Tomoe. The early campaigns were small-scale affairs, skirmishes, raids, territorial consolidation. Yoshinaka needed to prove himself, to attract warriors to his banner, to transform his mountain base into a legitimate power center. And this is where Tomoe first appears in the historical record as a combat participant. The Heike Monogatari doesn't mention her in every battle. Medieval chroniclers had a frustrating habit of omitting details they considered unimportant, and apparently female warriors often fell into that category. But when the chroniclers do mention Tomoe, it's always in contexts that matter: major battles, critical moments, turning points in the campaign. This tells us something important. Tomoe wasn't just a curiosity, a token female warrior kept around for symbolic purposes. She was a key military asset, deployed in the most crucial operations. By 1181, Yoshinaka had consolidated control over Shinano province. His reputation as a brilliant but ruthless commander spread across Japan. Stories circulated about his mountain warriors, tough, disciplined, fanatically loyal, and increasingly, stories circulated about his female general who fought like a demon incarnate. But Yoshinaka didn't know that his greatest triumphs and his ultimate tragedy were rushing toward him at terrifying speed. The pivotal moment in Yoshinaka's and Tomoe's military career came in 1183 at a battle that would become legendary in Japanese history, the Battle of Kurikara Pass. To understand why this battle mattered so much, you need to grasp the strategic situation. By mid-1183, Yoshinaka controlled much of central Japan's mountainous interior, but the Taira still dominated the lowlands and controlled Kyoto, the imperial capital. If Yoshinaka wanted to be taken seriously as a major player in the Genpei War, he needed to defeat the Taira in a major engagement. He needed a victory so decisive it would echo across Japan. The Taira, for their part, needed to crush this mountain upstart before he became an existential threat. They assembled a massive army. Sources suggest anywhere from 70,000 to 100,000 troops, though medieval numbers are always inflated. Even cutting those figures in half, we're talking about a force several times larger than Yoshinaka's army. The Taira plan was straightforward: march through the mountain passes, corner Yoshinaka, and destroy him through sheer numerical superiority. It should have worked. Kurikara Pass, located on the border between Kaga and Echu provinces, was a narrow, treacherous mountain defile. The Taira forces entered the pass in early June 1183, confident that Yoshinaka would either flee or be crushed in a frontal engagement. Yoshinaka had other plans. What happened next was a masterpiece of tactical deception and brutal execution. Yoshinaka positioned his smaller force at the far end of the pass, making it appear he was preparing for a desperate last stand. The Taira took the bait, committing their forces deep into the narrow defile. They were packed together, horse pressed against horse, hundreds of warriors crammed into a space where their numerical advantage became a liability. Night fell. The Taira made camp in the pass, planning to complete their victory in the morning, and this is when Yoshinaka struck. He had spent days positioning forces on the ridges above the pass, warriors carrying torches, herders with oxen. As the Taira settled in for the night, Yoshinaka's forces lit hundreds of torches and attached them to the horns of oxen. Then they stampeded the panicked, burning animals down into the pass. Imagine the scene: darkness suddenly erupting with what looked like thousands of demon fires rushing toward you. The oxen, mad with pain and terror, crashing through your camp. Behind them, Yoshinaka's warriors screaming war cries as they charged down from the ridges. Chaos. Total, absolute chaos. The Taira forces broke. In the narrow confines of the pass, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to form defensive positions. Warriors trampled each other trying to escape. Horses threw their riders and bolted. In the confusion and darkness, Taira soldiers couldn't tell friend from foe. Yoshinaka's warriors fell on them like wolves, and in the vanguard of that attack, leading cavalry charges into the heart of the enemy, was Tomoe Gozen. The Heike Monogatari's account of the Battle of Kurikara doesn't detail Tomoe's specific actions. Frustratingly, the chroniclers focused on Yoshinaka and his male generals. But we know from later accounts that Tomoe was present and active in Yoshinaka's major campaigns. A warrior of her caliber would have been crucial in the close-quarter savagery of Kurikara Pass. The battle was a massacre. Thousands of Taira warriors died, either cut down by Yoshinaka's forces or plunging to their deaths trying to escape down the steep mountain slopes. By morning, Kurikara Pass was choked with bodies. Yoshinaka had achieved the impossible. With a smaller force using terrain and tactics, he had destroyed a vastly superior enemy army. News of the victory spread across Japan with the speed of wildfire. Yoshinaka was no longer a minor mountain lord. He was now a major threat to the Taira clan, a warrior whose tactical genius had been proven in blood. Within weeks, Yoshinaka marched on Kyoto. The Taira, panicking at the news from Kurikara, abandoned the capital. They fled westward, taking the young emperor and Toku with them, a move that would have profound implications for the war's legitimacy. Whoever controlled the emperor controlled Japan in theory. By fleeing with Antoku, the Taira maintained their claim to legitimacy even in retreat. But that was a problem for later. In July 1183, Yoshinaka and his army entered Kyoto in triumph. The mountain warrior had conquered the imperial capital. His forces controlled the center of Japan. He was awarded high court rank, given official recognition as a leader of the Minamoto clan's war effort. Yoshinaka stood at the absolute peak of his power and prestige, and Tomoe stood with him, a warrior whose skill had been tested in the fires of real warfare and had emerged legendary. If the story ended here, Yoshinaka and Tomoe would be remembered as heroes, victorious warriors who helped destroy Taira tyranny. Their names would be celebrated for generations. But the story doesn't end here, and what happens next reveals the darkest aspects of samurai politics and the brutal reality of medieval Japanese warfare. Because Yoshinaka's triumph was about to become his nightmare. Occupying Kyoto and governing Kyoto were two entirely different challenges. Yoshinaka was a brilliant tactician and a charismatic war leader. He understood mountain warfare, cavalry tactics, how to inspire absolute loyalty in hardened warriors. What he didn't understand was court politics, aristocratic sensibilities, or how to manage a restless capital city while waging war on multiple fronts. His mountain warriors, tough, disciplined in battle, became a nightmare for Kyoto's civilian population. These were men who had spent years in harsh mountain conditions, fighting for survival. Suddenly, they found themselves in Japan's most sophisticated city, surrounded by wealth beyond their imagining. Looting started almost immediately. Yoshinaka tried to maintain discipline, but he didn't have enough reliable officers to control tens of thousands of warriors spread across a major city. His troops appropriated rice supplies, occupied aristocratic estates, and roughed up anyone who objected. The aristocrats who had initially welcomed Yoshinaka as a liberator now saw him as just another warlord, maybe even worse than the Taira. And food became a critical problem. Kyoto wasn't self-sufficient. It relied on supplies flowing in from the surrounding provinces. But the Taira, though pushed out of the capital, still controlled much of western Japan. They disrupted supply lines, raided transport convoys, and blocked shipments intended for Kyoto. Within months, the capital was facing genuine food shortages. Yoshinaka's popularity plummeted. The court nobles, always fickle, began plotting against him. Rumors spread that he was uncouth, violent, impossible to work with, a mountain bandit pretending to be a general. Some of these rumors were unfair, but some weren't. Yoshinaka made critical political mistakes. He pressed the retired emperor to grant him titles and positions that other Minamoto leaders considered rightfully theirs. He alienated potential allies through arrogance. And most catastrophically, he failed to realize that his cousin Minamoto no Yoritomo, safely ensconced in Kamakura, was watching his every move with growing alarm. Yoritomo saw Yoshinaka's control of Kyoto as an existential threat. Remember, Yoritomo considered himself the rightful leader of the entire Minamoto clan. He was systematically building the political and military infrastructure that would eventually become the Kamakura shogunate, the military government that would rule Japan for centuries. Yoshinaka's independent power base threatened this vision. The two cousins were on a collision course. But before that collision came, Yoshinaka had to deal with the Taira, who remained a potent military force. In late 1183 and early 1184, Yoshinaka launched multiple campaigns trying to destroy the remaining Taira armies. These battles were brutal, indecisive affairs. The Taira couldn't defeat Yoshinaka decisively, but Yoshinaka couldn't deliver a knockout blow either. And this is where Tomoe's role becomes particularly significant in the historical record. During this period, as Yoshinaka's position in Kyoto became increasingly precarious, Tomoe served not just as a warrior, but as a trusted general. The sources indicate she was given independent command of forces, leading detachments in battles across central Japan. This wasn't symbolic. Yoshinaka was stretched thin, fighting on multiple fronts, and he needed commanders he could trust absolutely. Tomoe was one of those commanders. Think about what this means in context. Medieval Japan was not a society known for gender equality. Women could fight, yes, but women commanding troops in actual warfare? That was extraordinarily rare. The fact that Yoshinaka trusted Tomoe with independent command tells us three things. First, that her tactical abilities were genuinely exceptional. Second, that she had earned the respect of the male warriors under her command. And third, that Yoshinaka's situation was desperate enough that he couldn't afford to care about breaking social conventions. One account describes Tomoe leading a cavalry charge that broke through enemy lines and captured an enemy standard, one of the highest achievements in medieval Japanese warfare. Capturing an enemy's battle flag was both a practical victory, creating confusion in enemy ranks, and a symbolic triumph, proving your valor beyond question. But even as Tomoe was proving herself in battle after battle, the political situation in Kyoto was spiraling toward disaster. By late 1183, Yoritomo had decided to act. He couldn't tolerate Yoshinaka's independent power any longer. The breaking point came when Yoshinaka tried to name himself Sei-i Taishogun, the supreme military commander. This was the title Yoritomo wanted for himself. Having his mountain cousin claim it first was intolerable. Yoritomo assembled his army, and he put his most talented generals in command, his younger brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, and his cousin, Minamoto no Noriori. Here's where the tragedy deepens. Yoshitsune would become one of Japan's most celebrated military heroes, a tactical genius whose campaigns are still studied today. And now Yoritomo was sending him to destroy Yoshinaka. The Minamoto clan was about to tear itself apart. In early 1184, Yoshitsune's forces marched toward Kyoto. Yoshinaka tried to negotiate, tried to find a political solution, but Yoritomo was immovable. This was no longer about the Taira. This was about who would control Japan after the Taira fell. Yoshinaka, facing armies from both Yoritomo and the resurgent Taira, made a desperate gamble. He tried to seize the retired emperor, hoping to use imperial authority as leverage against Yoritomo. The plan failed disastrously, further alienating the court and destroying what little political support Yoshinaka had left. By mid-January 1184, Yoshinaka's situation was hopeless. Yoshitsune's army was closing in from the east. The Taira sensed weakness and were preparing to reclaim Kyoto from the south. The capital's population hated him. His food supplies were running out. And Tomoe Gozen, loyal to the end, prepared for the battles she knew they couldn't win. But just when it seemed things couldn't get worse, Yoshinaka received intelligence that changed everything. The intelligence was stark and unambiguous. Yoshitsune's forces were within days of Kyoto, and they outnumbered Yoshinaka's remaining army by a substantial margin. Yoshinaka faced a choice that was no choice at all. He could remain in Kyoto and be besieged, watching his army starve while surrounded by a hostile population. Or he could abandon the capital and try to break through Yoshitsune's lines, retreating to his power base in the mountains where he might regroup. He chose to retreat. Not because he was a coward, everything we know about Yoshinaka contradicts that, but because staying meant certain death without even the possibility of victory. At least in retreat, there was a chance, however slim, of survival and eventual resurgence. On January 20th, 1184, Yoshinaka and his remaining forces evacuated Kyoto. The sources differ on exact numbers, but most accounts suggest he had between 500 and 1,000 warriors left, a pitiful remainder of the army that had marched triumphantly into the capital just 6 months earlier. Among those warriors was Tomoe Gozen. Yoshitsune didn't give them time to organize a clean withdrawal. His forces harried Yoshinaka's retreat, launching attacks designed to slow them down and inflict casualties. Every mile toward the mountains was bought in blood. Yoshinaka managed to keep his forces together through sheer force of personality and tactical skill. He fought a series of running battles, using rearguard actions to delay pursuit while the main body retreated. These weren't glorious battles. These were desperate, brutal affairs where warriors died in small groups, buying time for their comrades with their lives. And then came the Battle of Uji, the first of 2 engagements that would mark the end of Yoshinaka's campaign. Uji was a strategically critical location, a river crossing protected by a bridge that controlled one of the main approaches to Kyoto. If Yoshinaka could hold Uji, he might slow Yoshitsune's pursuit enough to reach the mountains. If he lost Uji, he was trapped. He lost Uji. Monogatari. The battle was fierce but short. Yoshitsune's forces, fresh and well-supplied, overwhelmed Yoshinaka's exhausted rearguard. The defenders of Uji Bridge fought with suicidal courage, knowing they were buying time for Yoshinaka to escape. But courage wasn't enough against superior numbers and fresher troops. Some accounts place Tomoe at Uji, others suggest she was with the main body of Yoshinaka's forces. The historical record becomes frustratingly vague here, with different versions of events conflicting on key details. What's clear is that after Uji fell, Yoshinaka's position became terminal. He retreated toward Awazu, near the shore of Lake Biwa in Omi Province. This would be his final stand. The Battle of Awazu, fought on February 21, 1184, is where Tomoe Gozen secured her place in legend. By this point, Yoshinaka's force had been reduced to a handful of warriors. Sources suggest anywhere from 50 to 300 survivors, though the most reliable accounts put the number at the lower end of that range. These were his most loyal retainers, warriors who had been with him since the early days in Kizo Valley. They knew they were riding to their deaths. In samurai culture, this kind of loyalty, following your lord into a battle you know is hopeless, was considered the ultimate expression of Bushido. To die fighting by your lord's side was glorious. To survive while your lord fell was shameful beyond measure. Yoshitsune's forces surrounded them on the plains of Awazu. This time, there would be no tactical brilliance, no clever strategies, just a last stand against overwhelming odds. And this is where the Heike Monogatari gives us its most detailed account of Tomoe Gozen in combat. The Heike Monogatari's description of Tomoe at Awazu is vivid and specific, which is why it has captivated audiences for 8 centuries. As Yoshinaka's tiny force prepared for their final battle, he reportedly looked around at his surviving companions. His army of tens of thousands had been reduced to roughly 30 warriors. They were exhausted, wounded, and surrounded. Death wasn't a possibility, it was a certainty. The only question was how they would face it. According to the chronicle, Yoshinaka turned to Tomoe and told her to flee. The exact words vary depending on the version you read, but the message was consistent. You are a woman, leave now. Do not die here. Think about what this moment represents. Yoshinaka wasn't trying to protect Tomoe because she was weak or incompetent. By this point, she had proven herself in countless battles. She was, if anything, one of his most capable warriors. But Yoshinaka understood samurai culture's dark truth. If Tomoe died fighting by his side, her death would be noted, certainly, but it would also be complicated by her gender. The glory of a warrior's death was more straightforward for men. Some interpretations suggest Yoshinaka wanted Tomoe to survive so she could tell his story. Others argue he genuinely wanted to spare her the horrific death that awaited them. The text doesn't make his motivations entirely clear. What it does make clear is Tomoe's response. She refused. The chronicle describes her reply as essentially, "If you want me to perform one last act of service, find me an opponent worthy of my final battle." And then she rode into the enemy formation. What happens next is described in detail that suggests the chroniclers were working from eyewitness accounts. Tomoe spotted a warrior named Onda no Hachiro Moroshige, a renowned Musashi warrior known for his strength and skill. He was leading 30 riders, a substantial force that would normally overwhelm a single opponent. Tomoe didn't care. She charged directly at them. The Heike Monogatari describes the encounter with almost cinematic precision. Tomoe rode alongside Moroshige's horse, grabbed him despite his armor, pulled him against her saddle, and then, and this is the crucial detail, she gave his head a twist and cut it off. Let's pause on this for a moment because it's important to understand what this action involved. Beheading an armored, mounted warrior who is actively resisting requires extraordinary strength, skill, and nerve. Medieval Japanese armor protected the neck with both iron plates and layered fabric. To cut through this, you need a razor-sharp blade, perfect technique, and enough force to make a clean cut. The fact that Tomoe accomplished this while both she and her opponent were mounted, meaning she had to control her horse, maintain her balance, overpower a struggling armored warrior, and execute a perfect cut, tells you everything about her combat abilities. This wasn't just skill, this was mastery at the highest level. After taking Moroshige's head, Tomoe fought her way back through his stunned companions. They had just watched a single warrior kill their leader in a manner that should have been impossible. The shock gave Tomoe the opening she needed to break free, and then, according to the most widely accepted version of events, she fled the battlefield. But here's where history becomes frustratingly ambiguous. Multiple versions of what happened to Tomoe after Awazu exist, and scholars have debated them for centuries. We'll explore these competing accounts in detail shortly. For now, understand that Tomoe's disappearance from Awazu marked the end of her documented military career. But Yoshinaka's story had a few more bloody minutes to run. After Tomoe's departure, whether it was escape or a final mission completed, Yoshinaka continued fighting with his handful of remaining warriors. The Heike Monogatari paints his last moments with tragic poetry. Yoshinaka and his remaining companions fought desperately, trying to break through the encircling enemy forces. One by one, his warriors fell. Each death reduced their chances of survival, but none of them attempted to surrender or flee. The end came not from enemy swords, but from terrain. As Yoshinaka tried to ride toward a final position, his horse became trapped in a frozen rice paddy. The field looked solid, covered in winter frost, but beneath the surface it was deep mud. His horse struggled, sinking deeper with each movement. Yoshinaka, trapped, became a stationary target. An enemy archer named Tame no Kanehira, a Taira warrior who would be celebrated for this single shot, drew his bow. The arrow flew true, striking Yoshinaka in the face beneath his helmet. The wound was fatal. Yoshinaka slumped in his saddle. As enemy warriors closed in, he performed one final act. Following samurai custom, he turned his blade inward and took his own life, denying his enemies the satisfaction of killing him. His head was taken as proof of death, as was standard practice in medieval warfare. He was 30 years old. Minamoto no Yoshinaka, the brilliant tactician who had destroyed a Taira army at Kurikara Pass, who had conquered Kyoto, who had dreamed of reshaping Japan, died alone in a frozen rice paddy, killed by his own cousin's forces. The tragedy of Yoshinaka's fall extends beyond his personal death. He was in many ways a victim of the Minamoto clan's internal politics. If Yoshinaka and Yoritomo had cooperated instead of competing, if they had unified their forces against the Taira, Japanese history might have unfolded very differently. But the Minamoto were cursed by ambition and paranoia. They won the Genpei War, yes, but they did it by destroying their own family members along the way. Yoritomo would go on to establish the Kamakura shogunate, becoming the first shogun to rule Japan with unquestioned military authority. But even his story ends darkly. He would eventually have his own brother, Yoshitsune, hunted down and killed when Yoshitsune became too popular. The Minamoto celebrated loyalty and honor in theory, but practiced betrayal and murder in reality. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because the burning question remains: what happened to Tomoe Gozen after she left the battlefield at Awazu? This is where the historical record fractures into competing narratives, each supported by different sources, each plausible in its own way. The fate of Tomoe Gozen after Awazu is one of Japanese history's most debated mysteries. Multiple accounts exist, and scholars have spent centuries arguing over which version is most reliable. Let's examine each theory systematically. Theory 1. The honorable death. Some versions of the Heike Monogatari suggest that Tomoe didn't survive Awazu. In this telling, after killing Onna no Moroshige and breaking through his forces, Tomoe either took her own life or died fighting shortly thereafter. This version emphasizes that a warrior of Tomoe's caliber would never flee a battlefield while her lord died fighting. The logic behind this theory is rooted in Bushido principles. For a samurai, abandoning your lord in his final moments was shameful beyond measure. The fact that Yoshinaka ordered her to leave might mitigate that shame, but it wouldn't eliminate it entirely. Some historians argue that Tomoe's sense of honor would have compelled her to die at Awazu alongside Yoshinaka. This version has poetic appeal. It's clean, tragic, and fits the samurai ideal of a glorious death, a warrior who lived by the sword dying by the sword. But there are problems with this account. If Tomoe died at Awazu, why don't we have specifics? The chroniclers who described Yoshinaka's death in detail, who documented how he fell and who killed him, remain frustratingly vague about Tomoe's end. This suggests they didn't actually know what happened to her, which implies she didn't die where they could observe it. Theory 2. The Nun's Retreat. A second, more widely accepted account appears in later versions of the Heike Monogatari and in supplementary historical texts. This version claims that Tomoe survived Awazu and eventually became a Buddhist nun. According to these sources, after escaping the battlefield, Tomoe was devastated by Yoshinaka's death and her survival. She had failed to die with her lord, something that would haunt a samurai for life. Unable to continue as a warrior, unable to serve the cause she had dedicated her life to, she sought peace in Buddhist monasticism. The monastic life was a common refuge for samurai who couldn't bear the weight of survival. Buddhism offered a framework for processing trauma, guilt, and loss. Becoming a nun wasn't seen as cowardice. It was seen as a different kind of courage, turning away from the world of violence and seeking enlightenment. Some accounts claim Tomoe entered a convent in Echizen province. Others place her in various locations across Japan. The details vary, but the core narrative remains consistent. Tomoe lived out her days in prayer and contemplation, seeking redemption for outliving her lord. This version has the advantage of explaining why Tomoe vanished from the historical record. Buddhist nuns, especially those from samurai backgrounds, often took new names and deliberately severed ties with their former lives. If Tomoe became a nun, she would have intentionally made herself untraceable. But there's a third theory, and it's perhaps the most intriguing. Theory 3, the forced marriage. Several historical sources, including the Genpei Seisuiki, a more detailed variant of the Heike Monogatari compiled in the early 14th century, tell a very different story. In this version, Tomoe was captured after Awazu, either during the battle or shortly after. She was taken to Kamakura, where Minamoto no Yoritomo faced a delicate problem. Tomoe was a symbol of Yoshinaka's rebellion, but she was also a warrior of legendary skill whose death might create a martyr. Moreover, executing a woman, even a warrior, posed political complications. Yoritomo's solution was pragmatic and cruel. He forced Tomoe to marry one of his retainers, a warrior named Wada Yoshimori. Wada was a powerful figure in Yoritomo's government, one of his most trusted generals. Forcing Tomoe to marry Wada served multiple purposes. It neutralized her as a potential rallying point for Yoshinaka's surviving supporters. It placed her under constant surveillance, and it demonstrated Yoritomo's power. He could take even Yoshinaka's legendary warrior and reduce her to the conventional role of a samurai wife. According to this account, Tomoe lived for many more years as Wada's wife. Some sources claim she bore him a son, Asahina Yoshihito, who would become a noted warrior in his own right. The date of her death varies across sources, but some accounts suggest she lived into her 70s or 80s, an extraordinary age for the period. This version appears in multiple independent sources, which gives it credibility. The Genpei Seisuiki, while compiled later than the original Heike Monogatari, drew on sources that the earlier text didn't include, and the mention of Asahina Yoshihito is verifiable. He was a real person whose mother is identified in some genealogical records as Tomoe. But we can't be certain. The sources conflict, and medieval Japanese records were notoriously unreliable when it came to women's lives. What we can say with confidence is this: Tomoe Gozen vanished from the battlefield at Awazu in February 1184, and whatever happened next, she never appeared in a military context again. Whether she died a warrior's death, lived quietly as a nun, or endured decades as a warrior forced into domesticity, her combat career ended that day. But her legend was just beginning. The transformation of Tomoe Gozen from historical figure to cultural icon is a fascinating process that tells us as much about Japanese society as it does about Tomoe herself. The earliest source we have is the Heike Monogatari, compiled in the early 13th century, roughly 20 to 30 years after the events it describes. But this text wasn't a modern historical document. It was a war tale designed to be recited by traveling performers called biwa hoshi, blind monks who chanted the stories while playing the biwa, a traditional Japanese lute. Think about what this means for historical accuracy. These performers needed to entertain audiences. They needed drama, heroes, villains, and memorable moments. The Heike Monogatari is based on real events, yes, but it's shaped by narrative conventions that sometimes prioritize good storytelling over strict factual accuracy. So how do we know Tomoe was real and not an invented character? Several factors give us confidence in her historical existence. First, she appears in multiple independent sources, not just the Heike Monogatari. The Genpei Seisuiki mentions her. The Azuma Kagami, a historical chronicle compiled by the Kamakura shogunate, includes references that appear to be about her. Various genealogical records from samurai families mention a female warrior matching her description. Second, the chroniclers' treatment of her is telling. They acknowledge her abilities but don't romanticize her the way they might with a purely fictional character. The Heike Monogatari's description of Tomoe is matter-of-fact, almost clinical. She was exceptionally skilled at archery and swordsmanship. She served Yoshinaka loyally. She fought at Awazu. There's no embellishment about supernatural powers, no claim that she was divinely blessed or cursed. She was just extraordinarily competent at warfare. This mundane treatment actually suggests authenticity. If medieval chroniclers were inventing a female warrior character, they would likely make her more extraordinary, more obviously fictional. The fact that they present Tomoe as simply a very skilled human warrior suggests they were working from actual accounts. But as decades and then centuries passed, Tomoe's story evolved in the retelling. By the medieval period, Tomoe had become a popular figure in Japanese theater, particularly in No and later in kabuki performances. These theatrical versions took considerable liberties with history. They added romance, invented dialogue, created emotional confrontations that never appeared in the original sources. One popular No play, Tomoe, depicts her as a tormented ghost, unable to find peace because she survived while Yoshinaka died. This ghost begs a traveling monk to pray for her soul, to release her from the spiritual burden of her failure to die with her lord. It's powerful theater, but it's not history. The theatrical versions also emphasize Tomoe's beauty, describing her as not just a skilled warrior, but as exceptionally attractive. Again, this reflects the biases of later periods more than historical reality. The original sources that mention Tomoe's appearance do so in passing and focus primarily on her martial abilities. But as her legend grew, storytellers felt the need to make her conform to conventional feminine ideals. She could be a warrior, but she also needed to be beautiful. This pattern continued through the centuries. During the Edo period, from 1603 to 1868, Tomoe became a popular subject for woodblock prints. Artists depicted her in dramatic battle scenes, usually showing her beheading Onda no Moroshige at Awazu. These prints emphasized her courage and skill, but also carefully maintained her femininity. Elaborate armor, flowing hair, elegant posture, even in combat. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 brought massive social changes to Japan, including increased attention to women's roles in society. Tomoe was rediscovered as a symbol of women's potential, though different groups interpreted her story in different ways. Some feminists pointed to her as proof that women could excel in any field, including those traditionally reserved for men. Conservative voices used her as an example of women loyally serving male authority figures, emphasizing her devotion to Yoshinaka rather than her independent accomplishments. This tension continues today. Modern Japan celebrates Tomoe Gozen as a historical figure, but how she's celebrated depends on who's doing the celebrating. Some see her as a feminist icon, breaking gender barriers in a deeply patriarchal society. Others view her as exemplifying traditional feminine virtues like loyalty and self-sacrifice. Both interpretations have some validity, and both miss some of the complexity. If you're still here, you're clearly loving this journey. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more stories like this. But the question remains, what's the truth about Tomoe Gozen? Can we separate the historical figure from the legend? Let's just strip away the legends, the theatrical embellishments, the cultural projections, and focus on what we can actually verify about Tomoe Gozen. We know with reasonable certainty that she existed, Multiple independent sources mention her, and the details, while sometimes conflicting, share enough common elements to suggest a real person behind the stories. She was an exceptional warrior. The primary sources consistently describe her martial skills in superlative terms. The Heike Monogatari's description, worth 1,000 warriors, isn't dismissed by other sources. It's echoed or confirmed by them. She served Minamoto no Yoshinaka. Her relationship with him is documented across multiple sources. The exact nature of that relationship remains unclear. Was she his lover, his foster sister, his retainer, or some combination of these? But the connection itself is solid. She fought in the Genpei War. We can place her with confidence at the Battle of Awazu, and it's highly likely she participated in earlier campaigns including Kurikara Pass, though specifics are scarce. She survived Awazu or died shortly thereafter. The circumstances remain uncertain, but there's no evidence she died on that battlefield in a manner the chroniclers could document. What we don't know with certainty, her exact birth date or birthplace. We can estimate 1157 in Shinano province, but these are educated guesses based on context rather than documented facts. Her family background. The theory that she was Nakahara Kanedo's daughter is plausible, but unproven. Her specific actions in most battles. We have detailed accounts of Awazu, but frustratingly little information about her role in earlier engagements. Her fate after Awazu. The three theories, honorable death, monastic life, forced marriage, all have some evidentiary support, but none can be definitively proven. Her motivations in inner life. We have no letters from Tomoe, no diary entries, no first-hand accounts of her thoughts. Everything we know about her motivations is inferred from her actions as described by others. This uncertainty frustrates modern audiences who want clear answers. We're accustomed to comprehensive historical documentation. The idea that someone as remarkable as Tomoe Gozen could leave such a limited historical footprint seems wrong. But we need to remember the context. Medieval Japan didn't prioritize documenting women's lives, even exceptional women. The fact that Tomoe appears in the historical record at all is extraordinary. Most female warriors from this period left no trace whatsoever. We know they existed. Archaeological evidence, passing mentions in family records, and logical inference tell us that Onna-Musha were relatively common. But individual names, individual stories, those are rare. Tomoe's legend survived because she was attached to a major historical figure, Yoshinaka, and because she participated in battles significant enough to be documented. If she had been an equally skilled warrior fighting in smaller conflicts or serving a less notable lord, we might never have heard of her. This raises an uncomfortable question. How many other warriors like Tomoe existed, fought with equal skill and courage, and simply weren't recorded? How many female samurai accomplished extraordinary things that no chronicler bothered to document because documenting women's military achievements wasn't considered important? We'll never know, and that's one of history's quiet tragedies. But let's consider what Tomoe's documented existence tells us about broader patterns in medieval Japanese society. Tomoe Gozen wasn't an anomaly. She was exceptional, yes, but she existed within a broader tradition of female warriors in Japanese history. The Onna-Musha, the term for female warriors in Japanese, have a long, complex history that's only recently receiving serious scholarly attention. For much of modern history, they were dismissed as myths, legends, or rare exceptions. Recent research, combining textual analysis with archaeological evidence, has revealed a different picture. DNA testing of remains from medieval battlefields has found that a surprising percentage, estimates range from 20% to 35% in some excavations, belong to women. These weren't civilians caught in crossfire. They were found with weapons, wearing armor, bearing wounds consistent with direct combat. This doesn't mean medieval Japan had gender equality, far from it, but it does mean that women's participation in warfare was more common than later periods wanted to acknowledge. Why did this history get obscured? The answer lies in changes that occurred during the Edo period from 1603 to 1868. Under Tokugawa rule, Japan experienced long peace. The samurai class, no longer fighting constant wars, transformed into a bureaucratic elite, and this peacetime samurai culture developed increasingly rigid gender roles. The Tokugawa government promoted Neo-Confucian philosophy, which emphasized strict hierarchies and women's subordination to male authority. Women's education focused on domestic skills and child-rearing. The idea of women as warriors became embarrassing, inconsistent with the image of refined, controlled society that Tokugawa wanted to project. So the stories were downplayed. Female warriors of earlier eras were either forgotten or reimagined as exceptions, proving the rule. By the late Edo period, many Japanese scholars had convinced themselves that Onna-Musha were mostly fictional, poetic exaggerations inserted into war tales for dramatic effect. The Meiji Restoration began reversing this erasure, though ambivalently. Meiji reformers wanted to celebrate Japan's martial past as they modernized and competed with Western powers, but they also wanted to maintain conservative gender roles. Tomoe Gozen and other female warriors could be acknowledged as historical curiosities, but they weren't held up as models for contemporary women. World War II briefly revived interest in Onna-Musha as the Japanese government mobilized the entire population for total war. Tomoe was cited in propaganda, encouraging women to support the war effort, but this attention was instrumental, using her story for contemporary purposes rather than seriously engaging with historical reality. Only in recent decades have scholars begun systematically studying female warriors in Japanese history. And what they're finding is fascinating. Female warriors weren't just defending homes while men fought elsewhere. That happened, certainly, but women also participated in offensive campaigns, sieges, and major battles. They served as generals, strategists, and specialist troops. Some clans specifically trained female family members in archery and naginata combat as a matter of course. Why the naginata became associated with female warriors deserves explanation. It wasn't that women couldn't use swords or bows. Tomoe's proficiency with both proves otherwise, but the naginata offered specific advantages. Its length compensated for shorter reach. Its versatility made it excellent for defending fixed positions. And crucially, it was devastatingly effective against cavalry, making skilled naginata users valuable tactical assets. During the Sengoku period, the age of warring states from 1467 to 1615, several female warriors gained fame. Hojo Masako effectively ruled Japan as the widow of the first Kamakura shogun. Takeko Nakano led a combat unit of female warriors during the Boshin War in 1868, personally killing multiple enemy soldiers before dying in battle. These women weren't following Tomoe's example. Most had probably never heard of her. They were following the same logical principle. When survival demands it, train everyone who can fight. Tomoe's significance isn't that she was unique, it's that she was documented. Her story survived the centuries when thousands of similar stories were lost. She became the face of a much larger phenomenon, the representative of countless unnamed female warriors who fought and died without making it into the history books. But her story also carries a darker lesson about how easily history can be rewritten, how inconvenient truths can be buried under changing social priorities. What does Tomoe Gozen mean today? Her legacy is complex, multifaceted, and still evolving. In modern Japan, she's simultaneously celebrated and contained, acknowledged as a historical figure, but carefully positioned in ways that don't threaten contemporary gender dynamics. You'll find statues of Tomoe in several locations across Japan, particularly in Nagano Prefecture, where Yoshinaka had his base. Schools teach about her as part of Genpei War history. She appears in countless novels, manga, anime, and video games. If you play any Japanese historical strategy game, Tomoe is probably an available general character with high combat stats. But this cultural presence often sanitizes her story. She becomes a symbol, female empowerment, loyalty, martial skill, without grappling with the complicated reality of what her life actually meant. Think about the questions her story raises. What was it like to be an exceptionally skilled warrior in a society that expected women to be decorative and domestic? We can guess she faced skepticism, resentment, and patronizing attitudes, even as she proved herself superior to most male warriors. but the sources don't tell us how she navigated this tension. How did she process violence? Killing in combat is traumatic even for people trained for it. Tomoe killed multiple opponents in close-quarters combat, beheading at least one. Did this haunt her? Did she develop the emotional numbing that many combat veterans experience? We have no idea. What happened to her sense of self if she survived Awazu and was forced into a conventional marriage? Imagine being a warrior who commanded troops and fought in major battles, then being reduced to the role of a retainer's wife, expected to manage a household and bear children. How do you process that transformation? How do you maintain your identity when everything you defined yourself by is stripped away? These psychological dimensions of Tomoe's story are invisible in the historical record, but they're crucial to understanding the human reality behind the legend. Contemporary discussions about Tomoe also tend to avoid uncomfortable aspects of samurai culture more broadly. Yes, Tomoe was a skilled warrior, but she fought for a system that was fundamentally violent, hierarchical, and oppressive. The Genpei War devastated Japan. Thousands died. Villages burned. Families were destroyed. Tomoe participated in this destruction. We can acknowledge her skill and courage, while also recognizing that the wars she fought in weren't glorious adventures. They were tragedies. The Bushido code that modern people romanticize led to countless pointless deaths as warriors chose honor over survival, revenge over peace. Tomoe's story is most powerful when we resist the temptation to make it simple. She wasn't a feminist hero in the modern sense. She was a product of her time, fighting for causes and lords that she believed in, but that we might question today. She also wasn't just a loyal servant mindlessly following orders. The level of skill and autonomy she demonstrated suggests a woman who made conscious choices about how to live her life. She was, in other words, a human being navigating impossible circumstances with the tools her culture gave her. And maybe that's the most important lesson her story offers. History isn't populated by simple heroes and villains. It's filled with complicated people trying to survive, trying to find meaning, trying to be something more than their circumstances dictate. Tomoe Gozen succeeded at that. Whether she died at Awazu, lived quietly in a monastery, or endured decades of forced domesticity, she carved out a space in history for herself. In an era that tried hard to render women invisible, especially in military contexts, she made herself impossible to ignore. 8 centuries later, we're still talking about her, still debating her fate, still trying to understand who she really was behind the legend. That's a victory more complete than any battlefield triumph. On a cold February day in 1184 on the plains of Awazu, Tomoe Gozen rode into enemy lines and beheaded a renowned warrior, then vanished into history. Everything that came before that moment, the training, the battles, the loyalty to Yoshinaka, led to it. Everything that came after, the legends, the debates, the cultural impact, flows from it. But here's the twist that makes her story even more remarkable. We almost lost it entirely. If the Heike Monogatari hadn't been compiled, if those blind monks hadn't chanted her story while crossing medieval Japan, if later chroniclers hadn't taken the time to document different versions of events, Tomoe Gozen might have vanished completely. She would have become one of those countless female warriors whose names are lost, whose stories died with the people who witnessed them. The fact that we know about her at all required a chain of decisions by people who thought her story mattered enough to preserve. Chroniclers who included her despite cultural pressures to focus on male warriors. Performers who kept her story alive through retellings. Scholars who took female warriors seriously as historical subjects. Every one of them fought in their own way against history's tendency to forget women's contributions. And they succeeded. Partially, incompletely, imperfectly. But they succeeded. Tomoe Gozen. The historical figure may have died 8 centuries ago, either at Awazu or decades later in quieter circumstances. But Tomoe Gozen, the symbol, the inspiration, the reminder that women have always been more than their societies wanted to admit, she's immortal. When a young girl in modern Japan learns about Tomoe and decides she can be strong, can be fierce, can refuse to accept limitations, Tomoe lives. When historians push back against narratives that erase women's agency and accomplishments, Tomoe lives. When we ask hard questions about whose stories get told and whose get forgotten, Tomoe lives. The warrior who vanished from Awazu's battlefield never really left. She's been here all along, waiting for people ready to hear her story, ready to learn from it, ready to carry it forward into the future. That's the power of history when it's told honestly, completely, and without fear. That's the legacy of Tomoe Gozen. If this story moved you, if it challenged what you thought you knew about samurai history, if it made you wonder what other incredible stories we've been missing, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me which part of Tomoe's story hit hardest for you. Did the Battle of Awazu give you chills? Does the mystery of her fate keep you up at night? Are you team died with honor, team became a nun, or team survived as Wada's wife? I want to hear your theories, and absolutely subscribe, because this is just the beginning of our Forgotten Heroes series. Next time, we're uncovering another warrior who changed history but nearly vanished from it. Another story of courage, betrayal, and legend that deserves to be told. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, history isn't just what the powerful chose to record, it's also what the persistent chose to uncover. Keep questioning, keep digging, keep demanding that all the stories get told. The forgotten heroes are waiting.